A merchant collapses in the Taklamakan desert. No water for miles. He's dying. Then he reaches into his satchel, pulls out what looks like a brick, breaks off a piece, and 3 minutes later, he's eating a full meal. But that's not the strangest part. In 2015, archaeologists opened a tomb that had been sealed for 2,000 years. Inside, they found one of these ancient instant meals, still preserved, still edible. And when they tested it, they discovered something that shocked the entire scientific community. This wasn't primitive food. This was technology we're only now beginning to understand. What you're about to see will completely change how you think about the ancient world. Because these 17 forgotten meals, they weren't just food. They were something far more advanced. And the final one on this list? It's still being used today in the most extreme place on Earth. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It was a 5,000-mile test of human survival. Merchants faced sandstorms, bandits, starvation, and months without fresh food. So they invented something revolutionary. Instant meals that could last years, required no refrigeration, and could be prepared in minutes with nothing but boiling water. These weren't primitive rations. They were culinary marvels, packed with nutrition, flavor, and technology so advanced that some methods wouldn't be rediscovered in the West until the 20th century. Today, we're counting down 17 of the most ingenious, delicious, and forgotten instant foods that fueled the greatest trade network in history. And by the end, you'll understand why one of these meals is still considered so valuable that a single brick can sell for thousands of dollars. 17. Dried noodle cakes, ganmian. Imagine you're 6 weeks into a desert crossing. Your caravan hasn't seen a town in days. You're exhausted, starving, and all you have is a flat, hard disc that looks like a piece of cardboard. You drop it into boiling water. 3 minutes later, it transforms into a steaming bowl of wheat noodles, tender and ready to eat. This is ganmian, the world's first instant noodle. Invented during the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE, these noodle cakes were made by steaming fresh dough, then drying it under the sun until all moisture evaporated. The result was a shelf-stable food that could last for years without spoiling. Merchants carried stacks of these discs, knowing that a single cake could provide a full meal with nothing more than hot water. What made ganmian revolutionary wasn't just convenience, it was nutrition. Wheat noodles provided carbohydrates for energy, and because they were pre-cooked through steaming, they rehydrated faster and more completely than raw dried pasta. This meant less fuel needed for cooking, a critical advantage in regions where firewood was scarce. Compare this to modern instant ramen, invented by Momofuku Ando in 1958. Ando's method? Flash frying noodles to remove moisture. The Chinese had already perfected a healthier, oil-free version over 2 millennia earlier. And this was just the beginning. 16. Compressed rice blocks, mijuan. Picture a brick, solid, heavy, dense. Now imagine eating it. Rice bricks, or mijuan, were created by steaming glutinous rice until fully cooked, then pounding it in massive wooden mortars until it became a sticky paste. This paste was pressed into rectangular molds and dried for weeks. The result was a block so hard you could use it as a weapon, yet entirely edible. Merchants would shave off pieces with a knife, soak them in hot water or broth, and within minutes, the rice would soften back into a porridge-like consistency. One brick could feed a traveler for days, and because the rice was fully cooked before drying, it was safer than raw grains, which could harbor bacteria or pests. But here's the twist. These rice bricks weren't just food. They were currency. In remote regions along the Silk Road, where metal coins were rare, merchants traded rice bricks for goods and services. A single brick had standardized weight and value, making it both meal and money. This dual-purpose design reveals a level of economic sophistication that most people associate only with much later civilizations. 15. Dried tofu sticks, dugun, tofu. You probably think of it as soft, bland, fragile. But the Silk Road version was nothing like that. Dried tofu sticks, or dugan, were made by pressing fresh tofu under heavy stones to remove almost all water, then slicing it into thin strips and air-drying for days. The result was a dense, chewy stick with a texture closer to jerky than anything you'd find in a modern grocery store. These sticks were protein powerhouses. Soybeans contain all 9 essential amino acids, making tofu a complete protein, critical for merchants who often went weeks without access to meat. And unlike meat, tofu didn't rot. It didn't attract insects. It didn't smell. It was the perfect portable protein. To prepare, merchants would soak the sticks in boiling water for 10 minutes, then toss them into stir-fries, soups, or eat them plain. The rehydrated tofu absorbed whatever flavors surrounded it, making it endlessly versatile. Here's what's shocking. Western explorers who encountered dried tofu in the 13th century dismissed it as strange Oriental food, too alien to take seriously. It would take another 700 years before nutritionists recognized soy protein as one of the healthiest foods on Earth. The Chinese had been optimizing it for travel since at least the 10th century. But that was nothing compared to what came next. 14. Fermented black bean paste cakes, du chi bing. Close your eyes and imagine this. You're in a caravanserai, surrounded by travelers from Persia, India, Mongolia. Everyone's cooking over open fires, and the air is thick with smoke and spices. You pull out a small, dark cake from your pack. It smells pungent, almost rotten. You crumble a piece into boiling water. Instantly, the liquid turns rich, savory, bursting with umami. You've just created a gourmet broth from a single compressed disc. This is du chi bing. Fermented black beans, or du chi, were soybeans inoculated with beneficial bacteria and aged for months until they developed an intensely savory, almost meaty flavor. These beans were then mashed into a paste, mixed with salt and spices, and compressed into small cakes that hardened as they dried. The fermentation process did something remarkable. It broke down complex proteins into amino acids, particularly glutamates, the compounds responsible for umami, the 5th taste. This meant that a tiny amount of dao chi paste could transform plain rice or noodles into a deeply satisfying meal. But here's the genius. Fermentation also acted as preservation. The beneficial bacteria created an acidic environment that prevented harmful microbes from growing. These cakes could last for years without refrigeration, growing more flavorful with age, like a fine wine. When Italian explorer Marco Polo traveled the Silk Road in the 13th century, he encountered fermented bean pastes and was so impressed he brought samples back to Venice. Some food historians believe this encounter influenced the development of European fermented foods, though this remains debated. What's undeniable is that Chinese merchants had mastered fermentation science centuries before Louis Pasteur was even born. 13. Dried mutton strips, yang ru gan. Meat. The ultimate survival food, high in protein, fat, and calories, but also the hardest to preserve. The Silk Road solution? Dried mutton strips. Merchants would slice fresh lamb into thin strips, marinate them in a mixture of salt, soy sauce, and spices like cumin and Sichuan pepper. Then hang them in the desert wind until completely dehydrated. What made this different from simple jerky was the marination process. Salt didn't just preserve the meat, it fundamentally altered its structure, breaking down muscle fibers and making the dried meat easier to rehydrate. And the spices weren't just for flavor. Cumin and pepper have antimicrobial properties that further prevented spoilage. To eat, merchants would either chew the strips as is, like modern jerky, or simmer them in water until they softened, creating an instant meat stew. 1 pound of dried mutton could rehydrate into nearly 3 pounds of tender meat. Here's the kicker. Archaeologists excavating ancient Silk Road sites have found preserved mutton strips in sealed jars that are over 1,000 years old. When analyzed, the meat was still chemically stable, theoretically edible. That's preservation technology that rivals anything in a modern laboratory. 12. Tea bricks, chajuan. Wait, tea as food? Yes, and not just any tea. We're talking about compressed bricks of fermented tea leaves so dense they could stop an arrow. Tea bricks were made by steaming tea leaves, pressing them into wooden molds under extreme pressure, and then fermenting them for months or even years. The result was a solid block that contained not just tea, but a complete survival food. Merchants would shave off pieces and boil them with water, creating a hot beverage. But here's what most people don't know. They would also add butter, salt, and sometimes barley flour, creating a thick, soup-like drink called butter tea. This wasn't a delicacy. It was a calorie bomb, providing fats, salts, and stimulants needed to survive high-altitude mountain passes where oxygen was thin and temperatures dropped below freezing. The fermentation process increased the tea's nutritional value. Beneficial bacteria produced B vitamins and enzymes that aided digestion. In regions where fresh vegetables were unavailable for months, tea bricks helped prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases. And just like rice bricks, tea bricks became currency. In Tibet, Mongolia, and Central Asia, they were so valuable that taxes were paid in tea bricks. A single high-quality brick could be worth more than a horse. Even today, vintage tea bricks from the Qing dynasty sell at auction for tens of thousands of dollars. But what historians discovered next shocked everyone. 11. Instant dumpling skins, jiaozi pai. Dumplings, one of China's most beloved foods. But how do you make them in the middle of a desert, with no rolling pin, no counter, no kitchen? Enter instant dumpling skins. These were pre-made dumpling wrappers, rolled thin, lightly dusted with starch to prevent sticking, and dried until crisp. Merchants carried stacks of these translucent discs, along with dried fillings like preserved vegetables or powdered meat. To prepare, they'd briefly dip the dried skins in water to soften them, add a spoonful of rehydrated filling, pinch them closed, and boil or steam them. Within 10 minutes, fresh dumplings on the Silk Road. What's revolutionary here is the engineering. Dumpling dough is notoriously difficult to work with. It needs to be thin enough to cook quickly, but strong enough not to tear. The ancient food technicians solved this by adjusting the ratio of wheat flour to water, creating a dough that could be rolled ultra-thin and still maintain structural integrity after drying and rehydration. This technology wouldn't appear in Western cuisine until the 20th century, with the invention of dried pasta sheets for lasagna. The Chinese had perfected it over 1,000 years earlier. 10. Preserved vegetable cakes, jia chai bing, vegetables. Fresh, crisp, colorful. Everything that doesn't exist on a months-long desert crossing. Or does it? Preserved vegetable cakes were made from mustard greens, radishes, and other hardy vegetables that were salted, pressed to remove moisture, chopped fine, mixed with chili oil and spices, then compressed into small cakes and dried. The result was a concentrated flavor bomb that could last indefinitely. A single cake, the size of a hockey puck, could be crumbled into boiling water to create an instant pickled vegetable side dish. The salt and fermentation not only preserved the vegetables, but transformed their flavor, creating complex, sour, spicy, and savory notes that stimulated appetite even in the harshest conditions. Here's the science. The fermentation process created probiotics, beneficial bacteria that improved gut health. On long journeys where food variety was limited and digestive problems common, these probiotic-rich cakes helped maintain intestinal balance. Modern science has only recently recognized the importance of gut health and probiotics. The ancient Chinese were prescribing them a millennium ago. Not as medicine, but as everyday food. And this is where things get unbelievable. 9. Dried egg powder, Dan Fen. Eggs. Fragile, perishable, impossible to transport, right? Wrong. Chinese food engineers discovered that eggs could be transformed into a stable powder through a process that seems almost magical. Fresh eggs were beaten, slowly heated while constantly stirring to prevent clumping, then dried on hot stones until all moisture evaporated. The result was a pale yellow powder that looked like cornmeal. This powder could be stored for months. When rehydrated with water, it returned to a liquid egg consistency that could be scrambled, made into omelets, or added to soups. The protein structure remained intact, meaning the nutritional value was nearly identical to fresh eggs. But here's what's shocking. This technology was so advanced that when European explorers first encountered dried egg powder in China during the 16th century, they couldn't figure out how it was made. It wouldn't be until World War II, over 400 years later, that Western militaries developed their own egg powder for soldiers, using essentially the same technique. 8. Instant congee blocks, jo kwai. Congee, or rice porridge, is comfort food. Warm, soothing, easy to digest, but it takes hours to cook properly, simmering rice until it breaks down into a creamy consistency. Unless you have congee blocks. These were made by cooking rice into an ultra-soft porridge, then spreading it thin on bamboo mats and sun-drying it until it formed brittle sheets. These sheets were broken into chunks and stored. To prepare, a merchant would drop a chunk into boiling water. Within 3 minutes, the dried porridge would dissolve, creating a hot, creamy congee indistinguishable from the fresh version that took hours to make. The secret was in the pre-cooking. By fully gelatinizing the rice starches before drying, the congee blocks rehydrated almost instantly. This is the same principle used in modern instant oatmeal packets, except the Chinese perfected it during the Tang dynasty, around 800 CE, over 1,000 years before Quaker oats. 7. Dried mushroom crisps, mogu pian. Mushrooms are over 90% water. They spoil within days. They're the last thing you'd expect to find on a desert caravan. But dried mushrooms were everywhere. Merchants would slice fresh mushrooms paper thin and dry them in the sun until they became crispy chips. These chips weighed almost nothing and could be crushed into powder or rehydrated whole. When added to hot water, the mushrooms absorbed liquid and plumped back up, releasing intense umami flavor. A small handful could transform plain noodles into a gourmet meal. Here's the twist. The drying process actually concentrated the flavor compounds. Dried mushrooms taste more intensely mushroomy than fresh ones because the evaporation of water leaves behind a higher concentration of glutamates and other savory molecules. Japanese cuisine later adopted this technique, creating dried shiitake mushrooms that became a cornerstone of traditional cooking. But the Chinese had been perfecting mushroom preservation for centuries before. 6. Portable soup cubes, gu tang kwai, bone broth. Rich, nourishing, packed with collagen and minerals, and absolutely impossible to carry in liquid form. So they made it solid, Portable soup cubes were created by simmering bones, meat, and vegetables for days until all the nutrients dissolved into the liquid. This liquid was then continuously boiled down, reducing and reducing until it became a thick, gelatinous paste. This paste was spread thin, dried, and cut into cubes. A single cube, about the size of a dice, could be dissolved in hot water to create a full bowl of rich broth. These cubes were essentially the world's first bouillon cubes, predating European versions by centuries. What's remarkable is the nutritional density. The long, simmering extracted collagen from bones, which dried into gelatin. When rehydrated, this gelatin provided protein and amino acids that supported joint health, skin elasticity, and digestive function. Merchants traveling for months without fresh meat could maintain their health with these cubes. British sailors in the 18th century carried a similar product called portable soup, which they credited with preventing scurvy on long voyages. Historians now believe this recipe was adapted from Chinese traders encountered in Asian ports. 5. Dried soy milk. Skin sheets, fuju. When you heat soy milk, a thin skin forms on the surface. Most people discard it. The Chinese turned it into a delicacy. This skin, called yuba or fuju, was carefully lifted off, draped over racks, and dried. The result was a delicate sheet, almost translucent, with a creamy, slightly sweet flavor. Dried yuba sheets could be stored indefinitely. When soaked in water, they softened into a silky, tender texture perfect for wrapping around fillings, adding to soups, or eating plain. But here's what made yuba special. It was almost pure protein. Soy milk skin contains concentrated soy proteins and lipids, making it one of the most protein-dense plant foods available. For Buddhist monks traveling the Silk Road, who ate no meat, yuba was an essential protein source. The sheets were so valuable that they became a luxury item. High-quality yuba was given as gifts to royalty. Even today, premium dried yuba can cost more per pound than beef. 4. Fermented wine lees cakes, Juzao Bing. After making rice wine, you're left with fermented rice residue called wine lees. Most brewers throw it away. Silk Road merchants ate it. Wine lees were pressed into cakes and dried. These cakes had a complex, tangy flavor with a subtle alcohol warmth. They could be crumbled into hot water to make a sweet, slightly intoxicating porridge, or eaten as is for a quick energy boost. Here's the science. Wine lees contain active yeast, enzymes, B vitamins, and probiotics created during fermentation. When consumed, these compounds aided digestion, boosted energy, and even provided mild antimicrobial protection against foodborne illness. But the most surprising benefit? The alcohol content. Even after drying, wine lees retained trace amounts of alcohol, typically around 2 to 5%. In regions where water quality was questionable, eating wine lees cakes provided hydration without the risk of waterborne diseases. The alcohol acted as a natural disinfectant. This dual-purpose food, nutrition plus safety, exemplifies the sophisticated understanding ancient Chinese food technologists had of chemistry and biology, long before these sciences formally existed. 3. Compressed soup noodles, tang mian tuan. Imagine a food so advanced that it wouldn't be reinvented until astronauts needed meals in space. Compressed soup noodles combined everything. Noodles, dried vegetables, powdered broth, and seasonings, all compressed into a single dense ball about the size of a fist. To prepare, you simply drop the ball into boiling water. As it dissolved, the components separated. Noodles softened. Vegetables rehydrated. Broth powder dissolved. Within 5 minutes, You had a complete, balanced meal in a bowl. The engineering behind this is staggering. Each ingredient had to be processed to the exact moisture level so that everything rehydrated at the same rate. Too much moisture and the ball would spoil. Too little, and ingredients wouldn't rehydrate properly. The ratios had to be perfect. Archaeologists have found compressed soup noodle remains in Silk Road cave dwellings dated to the 10th century. When analyzed, the composition was remarkably similar to modern instant ramen cups, except healthier, with no artificial preservatives or flavor enhancers. Everything was natural, yet shelf-stable for years. 2. Honey-preserved meat, mijiru. Honey. Sweet, sticky, seemingly incompatible with savory meat, but it's also one of nature's most powerful preservatives. Ancient Chinese merchants discovered that meat submerged in honey could be preserved indefinitely. The honey created an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. Too high in sugar, too low in water, too acidic. The meat essentially became suspended in time. To prepare honey-preserved meat for travel, merchants would drain off excess honey, slice the meat thin, and dry it further. The result was a sweet, savory jerky with complex caramelized flavors. When rehydrated in hot water or broth, the meat softened while releasing honey's subtle sweetness, creating a unique flavor profile that blended savory and sweet in ways Western cuisine wouldn't explore until modern fusion cooking. Here's the mind-blowing part. In 2015, archaeologists excavating a tomb in China found a sealed bronze vessel containing honey-preserved meat over 2,000 years old. When analyzed, the meat was still chemically preserved, with no signs of decay. The honey had done its job for 2 millennia. 1. The ultimate survival food. Tsampa, Zaomian. We've reached number 1. The most important, most versatile, most revolutionary instant food on the Silk Road. Tsampa. It doesn't look like much. Just a coarse flour, usually made from roasted barley, sometimes wheat or oats. But this humble powder was the difference between life and death for countless travelers. Here's how it was made. Grain was roasted until lightly toasted, which killed any bacteria and gave it a nutty flavor. Then it was ground into flour. That's it. No cooking, no fermentation, just roasted grain flour. But the simplicity is deceptive. Because tsampa is pre-roasted, it's already cooked. You can eat it raw by mixing it with water, tea, or butter to form a dough, then eating it immediately. No fire needed, no fuel needed, no time needed. In emergencies, when sandstorms made cooking impossible, or when fleeing bandits meant no time to stop, tsampa kept people alive. Mix it with melted snow, and you had instant calories. Mix it with tea, and you had a complete meal. The roasting process did something crucial. It gelatinized the starches in the grain, making them easier to digest and faster to absorb. This meant rapid energy, critical when facing physical exhaustion. Tsampa was so efficient that Tibetan and Mongolian cultures adopted it as their staple food. Even today, Tibetan nomads carry tsampa as their primary food source. Mountaineers climbing Everest pack tsampa because it provides maximum calories with minimum weight and preparation. Here's the final revelation. When NASA developed emergency rations for astronauts in the 1960s, they created a product remarkably similar to tsampa. Pre-cooked, powdered grains that could be mixed with water and consumed instantly. They called it space food. The Silk Road had been using it for over 1,000 years. 17 forgotten foods, each one a masterpiece of engineering, nutrition, and survival. These weren't primitive rations. They were sophisticated technologies developed through centuries of trial, error, and genius. The merchants who traveled the Silk Road faced conditions that would kill most modern people within days. Yet they crossed deserts, scaled mountains, and connected civilizations because they had something we've forgotten. The knowledge that food isn't just fuel. It's survival technology. Every instant meal you eat today, every freeze-dried camping food, every protein bar, every emergency ration, traces its lineage back to these ancient innovations. The Silk Road didn't just trade silk and spices. It traded ideas that changed how humanity eats. So the next time you pour boiling water over instant noodles, remember, you're not eating modern convenience, you're eating history. If this blew your mind, subscribe to Dark Age. We're uncovering the forgotten technologies that built our world. Drop a comment telling us which instant meal shocked you most. And share this with someone who thinks ancient people had nothing to teach us. Because the past wasn't primitive. It was genius. We just forgot to look. Just